All right, are we ready? Good morning, everyone. Is the sound all right? Welcome to the CIA and the Wilderness of Mirrors, in which 4 Americans here will discuss our country's lovely intelligence agency. I am very pleased to be joined here. Immediately to my right is Kai Bird, who is a historian, the author of a number of books, including The Chairman, John J. McCloy and the Making of the American Establishment, American Prometheus, a biography of Robert Oppenheimer, written with Martin Sherwin, which won the Pulitzer Prize, Crossing Mandelbaum Gate, which is a memoir of your childhood in the Middle East, and most recently, The Good Spy, The Life and Death of Robert Ames, a CIA officer about whom we will be hearing much. Next to him is Scott Anderson, who's the author of 2 novels, Triage and Moonlight Hotel, and 5 nonfiction books, most recently Lawrence in Arabia, which some of you may have heard us discuss on the first day of the festival. Scott is a journalist who's reported from just about every dangerous place there is. And similarly, Charles Glass, all the way to the right, the author of Tribes with Flags, a dangerous passage through the chaos of the Middle East, a kind of sequel maybe 15 years later, The Tribes Triumphant, a book called The Northern Front about the beginning of the Iraq War, and most recently, The Deserters, a hidden history of World War II. So, gentlemen, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
I thought we would start, there's a cliche that I'm fond of that often gets repeated on stages like this one about India, which is that people like to say that whatever you say about India and its opposite are both true, which I think is probably true of most countries. But I feel like it's true of the CIA as well, which is that we have in kind of popular culture and in popular representations of the American CIA, on the one hand, these sort of sinister spies who secretly pull the strings all over the world, who topple governments, who pay off politicians, who fund tomorrow's terrorists today. And then on the other hand, we have these hapless American bumblers who hatch failed schemes, and their work is always coming back to haunt the United States. So I thought we would begin simply with Kai, who's written a whole book now about what you take to be a very successful CIA officer. What do spies do, right? What is the daily life of a spy out in the field? What is the purpose of an agency like the CIA?
Well, I want to first say, can everyone hear me?
Louder.
I want to first say that Robert Ames and most of these CIA officers are not James Bond. That's a complete fantasy in many ways. Robert Ames did occasionally have to walk around with a pistol in his belt during the Civil War in Aden and likewise in Beirut, but he never killed anyone. And if you read The Good Spy, you really get a sense of how mundane the day-to-day work was. It's a lot of listening to people and then a lot of writing about what was said. And it's hard, mundane, it's reporting. It's good journalistic reporting. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, well, so then the question becomes, what do spies do that is different from what a diplomat does?
You want to take that, Charlie?
Well,
maybe I'll preface this, Charlie, by saying, we have here 3 guys who've written or are writing about different eras in the history of the CIA or the history of intelligence. Charlie, you're working on a book about a British intelligence operation or an agency that is a kind of predecessor to the CIA in terms of training. So tell us a bit about that and what those guys did. What was the SOE?
In 1940, after the retreat of the British and part of the French army from Dunkirk to Britain, the British intelligence service, SIS, the Secret Intelligence Service, was left without a single agent on the European continent. They had all fled or been killed. They decided at that time, because of the failure of SIS to predict that the Wehrmacht would be coming through the Low Countries and into France so quickly with the Blitzkrieg, that they needed to get intelligence officers into those areas by hook or by crook. But more importantly, they wanted to get saboteurs. They wanted to get people who would harass the Germans from the rear. So they created a separate agency. They didn't want to leave it to the intelligence gathering people, because intelligence gathering requires stealth. It requires you to be inconspicuous and quiet, whereas sabotage involves exploding things, blowing things up, organizing people, trusting people you don't know, and potentially revealing yourself publicly. So they created two separate agencies, or they had one agency, SIS. They created something called Special Operations Executive to send agents throughout all of the occupied territories. That meant the territories occupied by Japan in East Asia, as well as the territories occupied by Germany in Europe. And they created stations in all of those places to organize resistance, blow up trains, blow up power stations. And the important thing was that these two activities not be confused. So when they sent their intelligence agents, they would be disguised as farmers or even sometimes as German soldiers to gather information as quietly as possible and get it back to London, whereas the others were taking directions from London what they should be blowing up. SOE became the model for the first American intelligence service called OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. SOE became the model and the trainer of OSS. So they created something called Camp X in Canada to train American agents, because outside military intelligence, the United States did not have a global intelligence network at that time. They trained them, so they adopted the SOE methods of subversion, of organizing resistance to the governments in the occupied territories. But OSS was also intelligence gathering. So the CIA, which was created out of the OSS after the war, never separated those two functions. So you'd have agents in the field who were, on the one hand, gathering information, on the other hand, torturing people or bribing foreign officials, or in 1949 in Syria, overthrowing an elected parliamentary government on behalf of the Arabian Oil Company to have a dictator who would then allow an oil line to go through Syria. I mean, created terrible problems for Syria, and they never really had a democracy again. We see some of the effects of this today. But this confusion of intelligence gathering with operations is something that's plagued the CIA, whereas the British, they had the SIS, and after the war, they disbanded SOE because they weren't going to be doing that kind of things, because they were not trying to subvert regimes, they were trying to preserve regimes. And that's a very different function and a very different objective.
So, Scott, I mean, what Charlie is talking about, this kind of sabotage, this blowing up bridges, this is a bit of what Lawrence of Arabia was doing, right? I mean, he's sort of would be described maybe not as a spy, but as a kind of intelligence officer.
Right, and to kind of pick up on where Charlie left off, with the early CIA in the late 40s, they clearly imagined their function as very much a carry-on from what they were doing with the OSS in World War II. And so in the early days of the Cold War against the Soviets, they were dropping agents behind the lines. They're dropping saboteurs, anti-communist emigres behind the Iron Curtain. And almost every operation, virtually every operation, was an utter disaster. They got hundreds and hundreds of people killed. Certainly in Eastern Europe, every operation was a disaster.
And you're talking here about the early 1950s,
late 40s, early 50s, and plus all these anti-communist emigre groups that were working for the CIA. All of them were completely infiltrated by the Soviets. So I think it took a long time, and a very crucial period, this 4 or 5 year period, where the Americans really, they didn't reimagine what their mission was. They were still thinking of this wartime mission where you could recruit local agents, and you were fighting it was very different fighting against the Nazis in occupied countries in Europe, and fighting the Soviet machinery that was set up and very quickly entrenched throughout Eastern Europe. So I think, from very early on, the CIA got off to a wrong footing in their operations.
Well, and we have, as we're talking here about the SOE and the OSS and then the creation of the CIA, we have an organization that sort of, in some ways, is shaped by World War II and then comes into being essentially during the Cold War, right? And the CIA is kind of organizes itself as a part of the Cold War battle or the standoff with the Soviets. How does it evolve, in the Middle East specifically? So this phrase that William has put in our panel title, "The Wilderness of Mirrors," comes from Kai's book. Has the CIA in the Middle East done notably worse than it did elsewhere? Is there something unique to the Middle East that has been troublesome for the CIA? Has it screwed up there more? Or is it just that this is a particularly thorny and tricky part of the world? I mean, all of us have worked there. So Kai, why don't you start here?
As a rule, it's screwed up everywhere.
Right.
You know, you think of Vietnam, you think of Laos, you think of Congo, Lumumba's assassination in Congo in the early 60s. Generally, the history of the CIA is a history of failures, one after another. Even there's, quote, successes in the coup in Iran or in Guatemala, years later resulted in terrible blowback with the counter-revolution as such with the Ayatollah Khomeini, and all coming back to, you know, that's a direct result of that intervention. But this argument from the very beginning of the CIA has always been true. You know, what is their mission? Is it covert action? Is it covert action? Is it the collection of human intelligence? Is it a paramilitary thing? You know, when Robert Ames, the subject of My Good Spy, was operating in the 60s, 70s, and 80s before he was killed, there was a ban on assassination that was imposed by executive order as a result of the investigations in 1975 of the Church Committee hearings. Today, the CIA, since post 9/11, its main mission is managing the drone program, which is an assassination program. And the CIA officers that I interviewed, who are all retired for The Good Spy, universally complain and are frustrated that their mission has been corrupted, that the agency has lost its way, that it's no longer doing what it was supposed to do. Its original mission was the covert collection of human intelligence to go where diplomats could not go for one reason or another, and make friendships and contacts and gather real human intelligence about intentions and motivations rather than simply listening in on phone conversations and email.
Charlie, you've been working as a reporter in the Middle East for 30-some years now. I hope I'm doing the math right there.
More, actually.
More than that. And you would have overlapped, I think, for a time with Robert Ames,
Yes,
who when he was in Beirut. Can you talk a little bit over your time in the region? What have you seen of the CIA, right? I mean, when you land up in a place like Beirut in the 1980s, do you know, well, that guy's really with the CIA? Do you see, okay, well, that local politician or that local warlord is getting money from the CIA? I mean, what does the footprint of the CIA in the ground look like to a reporter?
Well, one of the unfortunate things was that every American in Beirut was suspected of being in the CIA.
Right.
Including all of the reporters.
I can say this is true of American journalists in India as well. So.
However, the CIA, I can say, is clever enough to employ better people than us. I arrived just at the end of the golden age of the CIA agents in Beirut. In the 1950s, 1960s, they all used to gather, and one of whom was the bureau chief of the New York Times, and Kim Philby was there at the same time. They used to gather at the bar of the St. George Hotel, which was the most beautiful hotel in Beirut, right on the sea. And every day the oil men, the diplomats, the spies, the journalists would gather at the bar. And I came just at the end of that era, because the hotel was blown up shortly thereafter in 1975. And it was a time when they were rigging the Lebanese elections, they were staging coups d'etat in Syria, and from Beirut they were even trying to arrange coups in Iraq. They ran the region from there as their personal fiefdom. I mean, it was the real glory. It was Miles Copeland, Archie Roosevelt, Kim Roosevelt.
Bags of
Suitcases full of money that rigged the 1957 parliamentary elections in Lebanon, which led to the 1958 Civil War. The outcomes were never good, but they all wrote their memoirs. They had the time of their lives. They had all read Kipling. They had all studied Lawrence of Arabia. It was all very romantic to them. But the damage they did was horrible. It was truly horrible for all of the countries where they put their hands. they couldn't see it. I mean, they were running Nasser for a time. They had very close relations with Nasser. A very famous story where they tried to bribe Nasser with a suitcase full of, this is Kermit Roosevelt, they tried to bribe him with a suitcase full of money, and Nasser accepted the money. He wouldn't do anything they had asked, and he took the money and he erected a huge tower in Cairo, which is called the Burj al Roosevelt, which is a double entendre. It means the Tower of Roosevelt, also means Roosevelt's erection. This was Nasser's revenge on them trying to buy him off. But when I came, their main agents, local agents, were the Palestinians.
Okay.
So they had the PLO completely penetrated, as did the Israeli intelligence service. I mean, King Hussein used to say famously, the PFLP has more Israelis on its executive committee than the Tel Aviv Water Board. They knew everything that the PLO was doing all the time. Abu Hassan, who was Arafat's chief of security, head of his 417, was also a CIA agent. So when 1980,
I dispute that.
you can dispute that. He was a CIA functionary, you call it, whatever term you want to use. He was their liaison man with the CIA, and he used to turn people over to the CIA. The CIA never did any good for the Palestinians, because American policy did not allow anyone to do good for Palestinians.
Well,
the Palestinians lived in hope that this relationship would bear fruit, but it never did.
This leads me to my next question, which I think all three of you can pick up, but I'll start with Scott, which is that, you know, I'm most familiar with the Lawrence book. In that era, you have these guys out in the field. You have Lawrence, you have in your book some other characters who are sort of intelligence-related figures, including an American who maybe you could talk about. But when we talk about the CIA and how it has messed up here or there, to what extent are we talking about the CIA as an organization screwing something up? And to what extent are we talking about American policymakers who say to the CIA, look, I want you to knock over this guy Mossadegh in Iran, and the CIA does it, and we say, all right, great, that's fantastic.
Right. No, it's an excellent question, and I think very much the latter. I really don't. I think, of course, it's happened at certain times as kind of rogue operations. But I think almost every operation the CIA has done from its inception, they are following the policy of whatever administration's in power. And the period Charlie was just talking about, from the beginning of the CIA in 1947 up to, say, mid-50s, through the presidencies of Truman and Eisenhower, the early CIA had a very sort of very moderate Arab policy. They're actually really supportive of Arab nationalists, and the idea was to kind of supplant the little figurehead that the British and the French had left behind, and there are very progressive operations throughout the world in the very early, the late 40s. It all changed when the administration changed, with the Truman administration, and then even more under the Eisenhower administration. The American policy went from being this agent of democratic change, and from being seen as this kind of beacon of democracy at the end of World War II, to overthrowing governments, and then to overthrowing democratic governments. So
this is sort of the era of the, you know, he may be a bastard, but he's our bastard.
Right, and it happened in a very short period, and so the CIA was the vehicle that. And just to carry that one step further, you know, the CIA is always criticized for things they didn't see coming, like the Korean War, like the fall of the Soviet Union, things in Iraq. And again, there are elements. If you look at almost any of these kind of massive blunders that the CIA supposedly pulled off, there were people in the CIA who saw the collapse of the Soviet Union. What happens is, again, the administration, those voices, it's not what they want to hear. So they get winnowed out, and then you have this kind of groupthink that happens in the CIA, like in any organization, that is telling the guy at the top what he wants to hear.
Yeah, I was going to say, I have a good example of that from a CIA officer on the analytical side, who I interviewed after he retired, and he was responsible in 1964 for writing the Annual Intelligence Global Report. And he pulled it out and showed it to me. He'd taken a copy home. It was classified, but never mind. And he showed me a paragraph in which he said, here's my prediction of what was going to happen in the Soviet Union in 1964. He said, the Soviet Union is a empire that is going to collapse sometime in the 1980s, either from economic inefficiencies or ethnic internal conflicts. He was exactly right, but this man was completely ignored. And this is also a theme in this whole wilderness of mirrors. Even when they have successes and when they get good intelligence, the policymakers don't want to hear it, and they ignore it. And so you wonder.
So I want you to talk a bit more about Ames for a second, because I think people in the audience will, some of them will not have read the book. I'm sure a very small minority. Here you have someone, as Scott is sort of alluding to, where he's the man on the ground, and he has a far more, I think, pragmatic, and we might even say progressive attitude to what's happening in the region than the governments he's working for, and establishes a back channel to the Palestinians, in part by maybe getting out a bit ahead of what American policy was at the time. So tell us a bit about who this guy was and about what he did in terms of opening that channel to the PLO.
Well, he joined the CIA in 1960. He already then was studying Arabic and drifted into this. He spent his whole career in the Middle East. He learned very good Arabic. He very quickly became sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. And I wrote the book because actually he was my next door neighbor when I was 13 years old. And he lived next door to us in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, where my father was a Foreign Service officer. And I didn't realize it, but next door was the CIA officer. And anyway, he was a good spy, as I say in the title of the book, because he was good at listening. He was curious about the region. He surrounded himself with books and history books about the Middle East, and he learned the language. And he did form this back channel. He's famous inside the CIA for having formed the first sort of unofficial back channel to the PLO in 1969, at a time when Henry Kissinger and President Nixon had promised the Israelis never to speak to those terrorists, the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. Well, the PLO was a major player by 1969 in the streets of Beirut, and so this is a place where a CIA officer could go that a Foreign Service officer like my father could not talk to a PLO official, but Ames could, and he formed this back channel. Charlie has referred to Abu Hassan, Ali Hassan Salameh was the link. And there were rumors that he was recruited. My narrative in my Good Spy is that Ames tried to recruit him, quickly realized that he was unrecruitable, would not take money, would not sign a contract. This is what they actually ask foreigners to do, to sign a contract and to take money. Then they're bought men, Well, Ali Hassan refused to do that, but with Arafat's knowledge and encouragement, because he wanted a channel to the CIA, to influence Washington to start recognizing, to start dealing with the PLO. And Ames realized that this young man at 28 was not only Arafat's chief bodyguard and head of Force 17, but a very charismatic leader who could influence the PLO into thinking about itself as a political party, thinking about trying to eventually talk to the Israelis about a two-state solution and a compromise over sharing Palestine. And so it was a fascinating two-way street. Throughout this 10-year period, however, when they were meeting clandestinely, Mossad, the intelligence agency of the Israelis, was trying to kill Ali Hassan.
Right. Well, but what's interesting to me in this is the way that, spies can do what diplomats cannot. So you have Ames basically going to his contact, who is a Lebanese man or a Palestinian, Mustafa Zain, and telling him, the president has authorized me to reach out to the PLO, when it seems highly unlikely that the president, in fact, has authorized him to do that.
No such authorization.
Right. So this, what I wanted to talk about, and to bring in Scott and Charlie here, secrecy obviously is integral to how the CIA or any other intelligence organization does its job, and yet, as journalists or historians, how do you guys write about what the CIA is doing? How do you find out after the fact? What are the challenges there?
Although technically they're keeping secrets while they're while they're working. They almost all write their memoirs as soon as they leave and become pundits on Fox television. So we know a lot about what they're doing just from them. Helms, former head of CIA, wrote his memoirs, and there's a lot of detail. All of them. One of the problems that happened in Beirut, though, we're talking about Abu Hassan Salemi, was that because the CIA was so reliant on Palestinian contacts, when the Israelis drove the PLO out of Lebanon in the summer of 1982, they were left without any assets. So they didn't know any Shiites. They didn't know that Hezbollah was coming into being in response to the Israeli occupation. So they were shocked when these Shiites from South Lebanon came and blew up their embassy with the entire CIA station, regional station, in it. And they were all killed,
which is of course kills Kai's good spy.
For all those years, they had not cultivated anyone other than these people, and they were left basically blind to what was happening in Lebanon, the Shiite revival, which anyone from the Iranian Revolution, 1979, should have seen coming, but they didn't, they missed it. And so Hezbollah ran circles around them, still does, and defeated them, drove the Marines out of Lebanon, ultimately drove the Israelis out of Lebanon, and it all came as a terrible shock to the CIA.
Well, is the CIA, from books and movies, and, I think of, for some reason, of John le Carre, who's dealing with British intelligence, but you have a sense of sort of intelligence as a kind of chess match between, the British mastermind and the Soviet mastermind. Is an organization like the CIA basically set up to deal with other states and not with Hezbollah, Hamas, Al-Qaeda? Do we think the CIA has ISIS assets? Are there guys in ISIS who are signing contracts with the CIA?
Given that most of the rebels, but many of the rebels in Syria have been trained by the CIA in Turkey and armed by them, and many of them have gone over to ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, I'm certain that they have assets there, people they know. There's the main Chechen leader was trained by them in Georgia to fight against the Russians in Chechnya, and he's now in Syria. So of course they know these people. Whether they can rely on them is another matter. But they have long experiences. In Vietnam, they worked underground with people at all levels of society in the Phoenix program, where they gathered the names of suspected, what was called Viet Cong infrastructure. And that didn't mean they were actually Viet Cong fighters because they couldn't find them. But they would go to find their families, their friends, or people who put them up. They would knock on their door and blow their brains out. They killed assassinated 30,000 people in Vietnam in the Phoenix program, much like the drone program today, but I suppose a little more risky because you're actually seeing the person you're killing. And that was the one operation that William Colby, head of the CIA, said was the only successful operation America did in Vietnam. That's constitutional success.
Was assassinating 30,000 Viet Cong family members.
Exactly, but it also helped to destroy the Viet Cong so that when the North Vietnamese came in, there was no more infrastructure for them to rely on of indigenous South Vietnamese to govern the country. So they basically colonized and took it over. It was another success.
I want to move here to basically, since we've come to ISIS, to a bit of the sense of what the CIA does in the Middle East now. What is the footprint that it has? What is the presence that it has? How has the organization changed since 9/11?
I think this goes hand in glove. I think that the intelligence gathering has been, actually, after the U.S. Embassy bombing in Beirut, it changed, and it got more so after September 11th, where American embassies throughout the region and throughout the world actually have become these bunkers, essentially. I remember a few years ago, I was covering the conflict in Darfur in Sudan, and I met with the deputy chief of mission at the American embassy. I've never gone through more security in my life, and the entire building was encased in chicken wire and layer upon layer of anti-radar beams and stuff. And all the diplomats live in this compound immediately behind. So what are they seeing of what's happening in Sudan? Presumably, this is being done by the NSA or by CIA analysts sitting back in Washington, with assets, but it's certainly not doing much intelligence gathering in Khartoum. So I think they end up getting blinded, just as they did in Lebanon with the Shia. They don't really see what's happening in the country or right around them. And so then when all of a sudden they have to get involved, they turn to the Free Syrian Army, which was touted as these Western-leaning Democrats, and I don't know if there's much to choose between them and ISIS. So I think they're constantly caught out. And I have to say, I've met some smart CIA guys and women over the years, but as a company, as a corporation, which it sort of is. I've been thoroughly unimpressed by them. I often think of how people always have these ideas of, the CIA killed Kennedy, the CIA did this, the CIA, all these like really complicated conspiracy theories. And what I've seen of the CIA is these guys couldn't pull off a surprise birthday party. They.
Well, but see, something. Maybe we'll start with Kai here. Is the entire organization premised on the fiction that America can control world events, right? When we talk about success and failure, we've come back to this over and over again, the idea seems to be that once upon a time, and in certain quarters of Washington still, it was seen as possible for the United States to ensure that, our favored candidate wins the election, our side in such and such civil war prevails. This inconvenient, rabble-rousing, Lumumba type politician, he gets pushed out of the way. Can the CIA as an organization survive the end of this fiction? Or is it a fiction that Americans are just never going to let go of?
Well, there are many fictions. Unlike the British, we Americans have always maintained that we are not about empire. But of course, that's what the agency became. The CIA became the sort of intelligence agency for the American empire running throughout the Cold War. And then it lost its mission repeatedly. And it grew into a bureaucracy, a corporation. And as you know, with any big bureaucracy, a corporation, you try to do anything by committee that involves initiative and creativity, it's a disaster. So when Sherman Kent, a famous Harvard professor, was recruited by Allen Dulles, then the director of the CIA in 1953, to come and organize the new analytical wing of the agency, Sherman Kent said, well, Alan, I'll come, of course, but I can't possibly do the job if you give me more than 24 men. Well, the CIA today is like probably 25,000, 30,000, 40,000, we're not quite sure. And it's a mess. And if you want real intelligence, you should probably read the New York Times and YouTube. And
in 1998, Senator Moynihan put forward a bill calling for the abolition of the CIA, which unfortunately was defeated in committee. But I would like now to see that bill revived and passed by the Senate and the House, because it should not exist.
Well, so you've preempted what I was going to be one of my last questions, and now I'm going to ask it. And I'll start with you, Charlie, although you've maybe just answered, which is, if I made each of you the CIA director tomorrow, I don't know what powers vested in me would allow that to happen, what would your first moves be? So, Charlie, you'd shut it down.
Disband, but I would also try and find good employment for all of those people so they don't disperse around the world and go private and start doing things they shouldn't be doing.
Coups in Gambia.
Definitely get them jobs at Walmart.
Yeah. Scott, question to you. What would you do as director of the CIA?
Yeah, I probably wouldn't go as radically as Charlie. I think I would definitely get rid of the paramilitary side of things. If the United States is going to do that, it should be a military operation. And I agree with Kai. It's probably an organization 1/10 its size now would be smarter and certainly more efficient. But there is this group think that sets in, and I think this is, and they talk about this within the CIA. It's a constant battle of how the alternate opinion and the unusual initiative kind of works its way through this huge bureaucracy. They're quite aware that there's almost something kind of oxymoronic about having an intelligence bureaucracy. But anyway, I think I wouldn't get rid of all of them. I'd get rid of 90% of them, of the agents.
Very briefly, I would shut it down and turn over its responsibilities to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., which is a very good institution. It's an open You can read everything that they write, but they write in analytical
That's right.
intelligence.
Absolutely.
It's actually much better than whatever you see produced by the CIA.
Can we have any hope of I mean, something that came up in our conversation, before coming out here was, Charlie, you pointed out that it's almost like, long before the term too big to fail came into, conversation in America, the CIA was the original sort of too big to fail organization, right? We have the reports in the 70s, is it the Pike Committee and the Church Committee that basically say, you guys have been doing all sorts of crazy stuff.
And they put restrictions on them which are now being ignored.
Well, but right, and it keeps coming, and then you have '89. They don't see the Soviet Empire the Soviet Union is gonna come down. What is it that lets the CIA keep coming back?
Well,
and is there ever hope of oversight?
They're always looking. They're an organization that's always looking for a new role. So, after the Soviet Union ceased to exist, which had been their raison d'être, they were going around for several years looking to do commercial espionage. They were offering their services to private companies to do commercial espionage of foreign corporations. They really were losing their way, and they were afraid they were going to lose their budget. And luckily for them, in 2001, the catastrophe of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon happened.
Which I suppose we could say they did not anticipate.
They clearly didn't anticipate, or if they did anticipate, they didn't tell anybody. But they benefited from it at the end. It gave them a raison d'etre. And now with the war on terror, you can go on forever, because that terror will always exist in some form or another. There will always be some kind of resistance to you, and there will be people committing crimes. Because we're about to go to questions, I want to say that I want to applaud 3 people who have stood up to this machine and have suffered for it and have lost their freedom for it. Chelsea Manning, who's going to spend 35 years in federal prison. Julian Assange, who's locked away in the Ecuadorian embassy, not charged with a single crime to date. And Edward Snowden, who's stuck in Moscow and may never be able to come home again. Some friends of mine and I have put together a program to build a tribute, a memorial, or a homage to them, a statue built by an Italian sculptor called Davide Dormino, which is now sitting in Pietrasanta in Italy waiting to be bronzed, but the bronzing costs a lot of money, so we're trying to raise funds through something called Indiegogo. If any of you know where Indiegogo is and have a couple of extra dollars to spend, please give it. Because the bronzing, it's a 3-ton bronze sculpture which will be placed in the center of Paris. It's very, very expensive to do the bronzing and to transport it. We're trying to raise money, so if anybody agrees with what these 3 people have done and how they've lost their freedom doing it, please get on to Indiegogo, and the statue is called Anything to Say. We'd be very grateful for even the smallest donation. Thank you.
So let me ask Scott and Kai, following on this, I mean, is I think Julian Assange himself put forth a kind of argument that what he wanted to do was to almost make it impossible for these intelligence agencies to function, right? That sort of I may be misquoting him, but this idea that if you take all of this private, secret information and you force it into the public, it's not just that these specific documents are revealed, but that the actual secrecy that enables an organization like the CIA or the NSA to do its work starts to break down. So, CIA agents can no longer feel comfortable that when they write their reports, they'll be secretly transmitted back to Washington.
But more importantly, they will know that they stand the possibility of being prosecuted for torturing people. Torture is still a crime.
Because these things are coming out. So, to Scott and Kai, how have these revelations changed the game?
Unfortunately, I don't think very much at all. I mean, I think what we're into now with the so-called war on terror is the CIA is now, and other intelligence agencies they have justified their existence forever because you can't prove a negative. So if there is no terrorism, it means they're doing their job. If there is terrorism, it's a call for greater secrecy, greater
we need them more
resources.
than ever, right?
Right, and I think every time you see. I've watched the reaction or a lack of reaction to the Snowden papers in the States, and of course there's a small group of people who are outraged by it, but all it takes is a Charlie Hebdo to happen.
Well, right,
and you're just right back to where you started, and this argument is always made of. We need this intrusion, we need the surveillance to prevent the next Charlie Hebdo, and this will just go on forever. I'm afraid.
Kai, what do you think about this?
Well, as an historian, I applaud WikiLeaks because it's a great new source. But the other thing that you sort of realize when you read these documents is that, well, they look sexy initially on first inspection because they're, quote, secret. But then, you know, they become rather mundane. And you suddenly realize, well, the emperor has no clothes, so to speak. This reminds me of a interview that I had with one of my sources for The Good Spy, who was trying to explain Robert Ames's gradual disillusionment. And he says, well, you have to understand, when you're a young CIA officer, it's very exciting. You're suddenly exposed to all these secrets. And it's, you know, it gives you a rush of adrenaline. And then you think, as you learn more about these secrets and you gather more in-depth knowledge about your targets, and you think, well, you understand the complexities, and you can see where the policymakers are going wrong. And you think to yourself, well, if I can just get access to the policymakers and show them, you know, the whole story, my secrets, my knowledge, things will, you know, I'll change policy. Ames himself went through this exact trajectory. And then in the end, you suddenly realize that the secrets don't matter, the policymakers don't care, that, you know, U.S. foreign policy is not being made by this intelligence or driven by knowledge or expertise, it's being driven by domestic politics. And so he becomes more and more cynical and resigned and disillusioned with his own job. It's a very disheartening story for these clandestine officers.
And I just want to add to that. What also happens now is they stamp everything secret.
Well,
the most mundane stuff.
It was going to be my follow-up question, which is, you know, as people who write about this stuff, is it really what we have is a classification problem? And is this how the CIA protects, or the CIA and the NSA, the whole security establishment protects its prerogatives, is just by shutting down even the most basic releases?
I certainly think that's been the case. In the United States, they have this thing called the Freedom of Information Act, where you can petition to have government papers declassified and released to the public. That's been gutted. The FOIA has been gutted ever since September 11th. You can't get anything out of, virtually nothing out of the government now. And it started under the Bush administration, but Obama has continued the same thing. And it's not just, and what I think was mentioned, it's like often just they're covering their own asses. It's not, the secret that they're withholding is not some nefarious operation. That it's something they just did wrong. So you have an intelligence agency, or now a number of intelligence agencies, who can constantly hide their own failures because they're policing themselves. There's nobody watching over them.
All right, I think we should turn it to the audience. Thank you to all three of you. Where are the microphones? That guy right there.
I have a question here. I don't need a microphone. As the modern technology increased at this modern time, the laser is available in Italy and everybody else. We're saying that torture is a crime. What happens if people use laser to harm people and even kill? And which is the something we contribute to the heart attack or some other cancer or whatever. And that's the place that we should not pay attention to it. Because secretly, somebody get killed and nobody comes.
I'm not sure I follow that. We might have to take a question from down here.
Well, no, it was a statement. It was a statement.
Yeah.
It was-
What?
I understand what you're saying. It's a statement. It wasn't a question.
All right, so someone with an actual
Thank
question in the audience, you've got a microphone, go for it.
I want to talk about the WMD. Did the CIA get it horribly wrong, or was it just domestic pressure that they wanted to get after Iraq?
Very good question and short, that's excellent. Who'd like to field this one? Charlie?
I think it was clear from the beginning that the administration was going to go into Iraq. It had planned planned to go into Iraq even before they went into Afghanistan, and any evidence that came in that supported their case for going in became part of the dossier. Any evidence that, and there was a lot of it, that was contradictory was simply ignored. It was pushed aside.
Yeah.
They heard and read only what they wanted to hear and read, and agents in the field were told not to supply anything else. It's like for a reporter on a newspaper, if he's working for a very right-wing newspaper and he keeps sending in things that contradict the editorial line, he's not going to get his pieces in the paper. They wanted to get their pieces in the dossier, so some of them supplied information that supported the case. Some of it was also fabricated.
I think it's even worse, actually. The CIA's initial intelligence assessments were that no, there are no weapons of mass destruction. And Vice President Dick Cheney intervened and said, I want another report. And the agency was actually forced repeatedly to water down their assessments. And this is shameful, and people inside the agency are ashamed of it. It's a scandal, but it's been written about.
Yeah.
I believe, isn't it also said that George Tenet was sort of honored by Bush as a way of kind of, he was the fall guy, right? Kind of, he stood up and said, well, yeah, we made a mistake, when in fact that wasn't really the case.
Right.
Right there in the third row.
So is the average American citizen, with all this thing about invasion of privacy and stuff, are they also disillusioned with the role of the CIA? Do they realize that it's, it's quite futile to, as an agency, its role, and what it does to push, agendas that are already set by policymakers? So is there a disillusionment within the American citizens as well?
I don't think nearly enough disillusionment. I mean, it was kind of what I was saying a few minutes ago. I think that the administration or administrations know how to play the American public now, like a wind-up doll. That in the name of fighting terrorism and this big murky thing, you're not fighting the Soviet Union, you're not fighting the Nazis. It's this amorphous, unseen thing until some awful, ghastly thing happens. So it plays on people's most primal fears, and I think that the revelations coming out about the CIA. Now we know absolutely the extent of torture of people and prisoners in Iraq. Again, I'm not seeing a huge outpouring of outrage among the American people about this, because it always goes back to this idea of what, we're doing this to prevent the next terrorist attack. So I don't think there's nearly enough disillusionment.
In the front row.
Yeah, I think it's a continuation of that. All of you are saying that generally it's been a failure, and or whatever has been done has come back and it's hurt the United States. Why is it that the policymakers do not see this? And because from any side, it still looks like the US, and by extension the CIA, has a very selfish, arrogant attitude towards other countries. So why don't the policymakers see? Why doesn't the emperor realize that he doesn't have clothes?
Very good question. I'm gonna. Charlie, you want to take this one?
I think because the way in which national interests are defined are corporate interests, and the corporations have not suffered so much from these policies. In fact, whenever they maintain a regime like the Saudi royal family or try to destabilize the Iranian regime, they are doing so for the benefit of oil companies and arms salesmen. So they do very well out of this. Okay, the American public, I mean, a lot of innocent Americans and others died on 9/11, but that's part of the game. But as long as the national security state is protecting those global corporate interests, then the CIA will be able to go on doing what it likes.
Where is the microphone? Okay. Do you want to give it to the woman there on the aisle with the glasses?
I want to say one quick thing just in response to your question about American people. And I want to ask a question. The quick thing is that sadly, Americans are really not concerned about the rest of the world. The average American is ignorant, ill-informed, and they're not going out of their way to find out what's happening.
Question?
And it's very sad. I just want to say that's
I hear you.
true.
I've been there.
What I want to ask all of you is, this book was written, Mark Mazzetti wrote this book, essentially saying that the war now, our wars, are really the power, the volition behind those wars, the control of those wars is now in the hands of the CIA. So I agree with you that the CIA is kind of ineffectual, but the reality is, I think, that the drone program's really being run through the CIA. So how does all that square? I'm not saying this challenging you. I'm curious what you feel about that, all of you.
Yeah, well, maybe the question, if I can rephrase it slightly, is the CIA the driving force behind the drone program, or there are policymakers who are basically putting the CIA in charge of this? You know, I have a feeling it's not coming from inside the CIA.
Right. I think the CIA does the bidding of the administration, whatever the administration, on the policy level, on the guerrilla warfare level, and unfortunately also on the analyst level. So no, I think you have to go back to, in every case, to the administration. I just never have really believed in this idea of rogue operations by the CIA.
The guy
Well,
with
even could I
Yeah, go
add
ahead.
to that? I mean, the real problem is that after 9/11, we launched a war on terrorism. And the CIA was told, you are going to manage this drone program. Simultaneously, they went around picking up people and putting them in Guantanamo. And when Obama was elected, he had promised on the campaign trail, we're going to close down Guantanamo. And then domestic political politics the Republicans made it impossible for him to do. They passed a law saying you cannot bring any of these men to go through the U.S. judicial system to be tried as criminals and to be found guilty or innocent. So then Obama, I think what happened was that Obama then said, well, I can't arrest these people anymore. And if I do anything other than use the drone program to assassinate them, I'll be called weak. And he's a liberal Democrat whose worst fear is to be accused of being weak on the war on terrorism. So it's all driven by this idiotic attitude reaction to 9/11. Where we have actually done the bidding of the terrorists, who, an act of terror is an act of theater, and it's designed to get the state to overreact, and that's exactly what we've done.
the guy with the shaved head and the glasses.
I had two questions. Number one was on ISIS. We've all seen ISIS brutality. So who's going to tackle that? Because America is not going to put foot on the ground. The second one was in light of the torture report that has come out and the book by a Guantanamo inmate. What are we going to, is America really going to close down Guantanamo?
All right, I'm going to put Charlie on the ISIS question.
I don't know what will happen. I don't know who will control ISIS. I know how, I have an idea, I could be completely wrong by the way, I have an idea that it would be better to confront ISIS by having a coalition of ISIS's natural enemies, who are Iran, the Iraqi government, the Kurdish regional government, Syria, and Hezbollah. Those local forces combined could easily have a hammer and anvil east to west and take ISIS out. But the US, because it has its ideological commitment to opposing Iran, because it has a commitment to getting rid of the regime in Syria, and it has a visceral hatred of Hezbollah because Hezbollah is against Israel, it won't cooperate with those people. The argument for cooperation would be, well, in the Second World War, they cooperated with Stalin, who was not in any way a nice man and was an ideological enemy of the Western democracies. But without Stalin, they would have lost World War II.
Kai or Scott, do you want to take the question of is Guantanamo going away?
Just really briefly, it's possible, I think, but Kai's absolutely right. The Republican-controlled Congress, when Obama, it was one of his first priorities was to close Guantanamo. They denied the funds to close it. So by this kind of bureaucratic procedure. It's possible that Obama may be able to do something at the end of his term to close it. But But I'm not. I don't even think then. What I think is just this incredible irony of the Congress, their whole argument of that it's dangerous to try these people on American soil. And if you want to talk about being soft on terrorism, I mean, to say that we are not strong enough to actually try these people in our own country, that we have to put them on, a little enclave of an island. I mean, that in itself, if you want to be weak on terror, to me, that you can't get much weaker than that.
Well, I want to put a question to Kai, if I can steal back a little bit of time. You, in a way, are, of a sort, a historian of an American empire, in a way. And you talk about how, Obama fears looking weak, and yet the fact that Obama has escalated the drone program far beyond what Bush did, although he has not invaded quite as many countries, has not stopped him from being called weak, right? It almost doesn't matter what Obama does, he will be called weak. So coming off that Guantanamo question from the audience, are the imperatives of empire so strong that they can basically never be rolled back? Are we going to see in our lifetimes an America that has a more modest and kind of attitude of humility toward the rest of the world? Or is the domestic political pressure so strong pushing in that way?
Yes, it is a great irony of recent American history that it is often liberals who have driven the Cold War, liberals who have intervened. And my answer to this as an historian is that, it goes back to the terrible chapter in our history in the 50s, McCarthyism, where liberalism was questioned. The patriotism of liberals was severely questioned, and liberals ever since, including Obama, are constantly having to psychologically look over their shoulder to make sure that they're being strong. And my hope is that eventually this attitude is going to go by the wayside, and America will be strong enough to decide we need to come home and concentrate on our poverty, on our problems, and not worry about the world, and realize that the world is a complicated place and that we are not, in fact, an empire.
Will it take someone like will it take a conservative like Rand Paul, for example, who has a sort of very anti-empire?
Very interesting. Libertarian streak.
I mean, is it a Nixon goes to China kind of thing that only a right-wing Republican can?
Perhaps, but there are, progressive Democrats. Elizabeth Warren may have that attitude. I don't know.
And the American public, I think, has changed now too. I mean, after Afghanistan, after Iraq. I mean, we're on about a 4-game losing streak here when it comes to wars, so I think, and this is why I think Obama has relied on the drone campaign. There's no way he would ever be able to send, as long as, even though the Republicans call him weak, there's no way he could ever send troops in on the ground in Syria or anywhere else. So he's had to rely on these other things. So I think, at least for the time being, among the American public, there's no appetite for another American military misadventure abroad. But will that change in a few years? Could.
All right, I think we're out of time, I'm afraid. I want to thank Charlie, Scott, Kai.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Are you guys going to be signing books?
I think so.
I think there will be some book signing at the back. You can ask further questions there. Thank you.